everybody to today's session of the 50 Plus Shades of Gothic conference series. And today the session is Gothic and the Ethnic Other Bodies and Boundaries. Our first presentation by Stephen Shapiro is Intersectional Gothic, and my favorite thing is Monsters. Stephen teaches in the English and Comparative Literature Studies department at the University of Warwick. And he co-authored the Pentecostal Modernism, Lovecraft, Los Angeles, and World Systems Culture in 2019, and is now co-editing the forthcoming collections, The Cambridge Companion to American Horror with Mark Story, and another zombie project, The Colonialized Indian Dead, with Roxanne Douglas and Julia Campion with Bloomsbury. And the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Let me just, there we go. Okay, well, I wanted to thank the conference for the opportunity to speak. So the goal today was to be one of the first responses to Emil Ferris's second and final volume of My Favorite Thing is Monsters, which had been scheduled for February publication. Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters is a graphic narrative about Karen Reyes, a young Latinx lesbian, and her coming of age and sexual self-declaration in late 1960s Chicago. But given that Fantagraphics doesn't even list the second volume as forthcoming, and I've given you just the image of what may or may not ultimately be that second volume, it seems that we'll probably have to wait till the end of this year or longer to see this volume. So today, I'd like instead to revisit some of my more recent work on horror and update it in light of work in progress to give you a sense of why My Favorite Thing is Monsters is significant for contemporary understanding. And I'll just put it out there that I do think this volume is like the equivalent to Moby Dick or Huckleberry Finn. It's a major achievement of American cultural work in the moment. So my working understanding of horror's object of analysis is the focus on the mutilated and macerated body and pain within liberalism. If Frederick Jameson once said that history is what hurts, then for me, history is what bleeds, where the skin side no longer keeps our body's stuffing from splattering out. Following Emanuel Wallerstein's commentary on the rise of ideologies as political strategies in response to the late 18th century's French, American, and Haitian revolutions, alongside rebellions in Ireland, Egypt, and by South American indigenous peoples associated with Tupac Amaru II, I want to argue that the work of horror is to register and respond to the spasms of conflict and tensions within centrist liberalism. So for Wallerstein, the effect of the revolutionary era was to establish two new social truths. First, that social and historical change was now to be a constant. And second, that power would shift from the Ancien regime's shock and awe of aristocratic state and the church to popular or democratic rule. Unlike the other ideologies of conservatism and radicalism or socialism or Marxism, Wallerstein variously changes his opinion on these. So the three ideologies are liberalism, conservatism, and radicalism. Centrist liberalism, which became the dominant, so dominant that it forced the other two to adopt and adapt to its positions, liberalism sought to regulate the pace of these transformations, control the dangerous classes by the gradual extension of voting suffrage for representation and access to higher education as the institutional apparatus credentializing the managerial class who would be considered socially empowered to administer society. Liberalism would manage or muddle through a series of capitalism's crises of profitability by facilitating the deployment of intertwined social and cultural devices, primarily such as the creation of binary divisions, including separations like the public and private spheres, capitalist profiteering, and civil bourgeois society. And above all, and dominant within these divisions, is that between the exclusion from active citizen subjectivity from the social death delivered to those considered to be exchangeable objects. In this way, the problematic of horror is liberalism's various attempts to maintain the separation between the citizen subject and the objects of social death, be these women, children, non-whites, and so on, Horror as a cultural production especially appears in pulses of crises of liberalism, simultaneously challenging and reconstituting liberalism's dominant rule. So the body in distress, rather than the Gothic confused mind, is highlighted in horror because liberalism's binaries depend upon forms of embodied exclusion, where to have a body is to be disempowered, as plebeian and proletarian, gendered non-male, ethno-racialized non-European, and so on. So not only to have a body, but to have a body means to always be vulnerable to violence. So horror's gore reveals an inconvenient truth about liberalism's claim to operate on the basis of disembodied universalism, as it reveals that liberalism's civil society actually depends on the structural presence of violence, and that this violence emerges as both the force dealt to those seeking new inclusion into citizen rights, but also from the fits of bitter revenge by those contained within social death. So horror is often described as emanating from the breakdown of boundaries and the presence of others. But for me, these descriptors are too vague and non-historical, since horror tales emerge at specific moments when particular constituencies demand inclusion within liberal suffrage before their allotted time. Horror is what liberals hear instead of civil rights demands, and horror is also how the excluded articulate the nightmare of inclusion denied. Yet something is afoot in contemporary horror. If horror emerged as part of the historic constellations of a long secular trend going back to the 18th century, then as this trend ends, and my preferred threshold is the crash of 2008-2011, where we are now entering a moment after liberalism, which contains several manifestations, including post-truth and the rise of genre works to prominence, going from paraliterary to now arguably the center of literary and cultural studies at the current moment. So for horror and Gothic and the other genres, this change appears mainly in a substantive transformation in that these cultural works that were previously assumed to be produced and consumed by Eurocentric white, cis male, and heterosexual audiences are now ones belonging to a more global, BIPOC, and sex-gender expansive life world. In short, if liberalism no longer commands, then horror, as a paradoxical child of centrist liberalism, is also undergoing a metamorphosis. And my main claim here today is that horror and Gothic, along with other paraliterary or subcultural forms, are a leading engine of imagination about what a life world after liberalism might look like. What kind of experience system could we be heading towards? Here, My Favorite Thing is Monsters exemplifies this change in opportunity. I want to suggest that one aspect that makes the narrative a major accomplishment for horror is as it exemplifies what I've called speculative nostalgia. Speculative nostalgia differs from a slightly prior mode of critical nostalgia in that critical nostalgia often looks to dismantle collective imaginaries by historicizing and demythologizing a sanitized memory. But speculative nostalgia operates differently than critical nostalgia in several ways. First, the focus shifts from the liberal individual to the collectively experienced historical moment as a way of encouraging the consumer or audience to see the construction of social narrative and temporality. Second, the look backwards isn't towards a lyrical wonder of a better or more innocent time, but to a history that is often tragic and one that passes its trauma onwards across the generations. Thirdly, this mournful past is narrated not merely to record its events in order to seek justice by liberal authorities, but as a means for recombining society into a more politically aware and mobilized social collective, greater than previously what I've called an intersectional left. So speculative nostalgia enacts Christina Sharp's tripartite sense of being in the wake of historical tragedy and a post-burial social gathering meant to give testimony about the deceased and a new awareness, or what we today would call, of being woke. Now, the cumulative goals of these differences from critical nostalgia is to establish a new intersectional left, where intersectionality is not meant to be confined to the unit of the complexly formed individual, as the term was initially introduced to convey, but instead as an experience system of a variegated social collective that has come together through elective affinity and coalition building, rather than pluralist consensus, since it doesn't seek to erase particular difference within the alliance. My favorite thing is Monsters exemplifies these traits by using the language and symbols of horror as a means of creating an intersectional community of care. The elective affinities include Franklin, a trans Black American whose facial scars and height recall the movie Monster, which Ferris often draws him as looking like. Sandy, an imaginary, recently urbanized child of a displaced Kentucky coal mining family who's presented as ghoulishly white and emaciated like a hungry vampire. So this crew of monsters, and Karen, who inhabits the werewolf persona. So Ferris's commitment then to undoing liberalism's scars comes when a Holocaust survivor in the narrative speaks about the prostitutes in Weimar Germany, who were among the few who provided a modicum of welcome and comfort to the men disfigured in the First World War. And she says, of course, when the history books tell of the groups murdered by the Nazis, they never list the prostitutes, because I'm sure the mention of their deaths is considered a stain on the other victims. The attitude is that the lives of prostitutes are worthless. I think that's self-hate. Our world hates anyone who would accept us and our bodies and our secret desires without reservation. But that is what the ladies taught me, to welcome disdained things. To welcome disdained things, that is to say, to welcome all those who've been allowed or made to be socially dead, may well stand as my favorite thing as Monsters' grand motif and encouragement to its readers. So my last word today is to suggest what Ferris is doing with horror. Ferris's horror isn't simply to ask what happens when the socially excluded are valued for their dignity, or even what happens when a Franklin of community care replaces a Franklin of capitalist competition, or even what happens when we move beyond the camp of Cold War liberalism. It differs, I think, the book differs from earlier versions of camp and schlock horror by moving from a sense of bitterness, arguably, or ironic bitterness, to an attitude of community care. Rather, this is to say that in some ways the book exemplifies the fulfillment or desired fulfillment of the words of queer Black civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, who asks, or who can be read now as asking, what happens when horror isn't mainly created to frighten liberals in ways that will ultimately re-legitimize the rule, but instead to paint an entirely different picture for all of us who never felt comfortable within liberalism's false promises to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect on time. And so we can move on to our second presenter, and it's Mariana Tupan with The Outsider Cities of Gothic Discontinuity. Mariana is a professor at Doctoral School of Alba University. Her work spans a variety of topics, among which diasporic culture, philology, reflections on modernism and postmodernism, science and time, and she has published 17 books, among which the most recent are The Shakespearean Search for Archetypes in 2020, The Key to Change, Interdisciplinary Essays in Cultural History, 2017, and The Kantian Legacy of Late Modernity in 2016. Please, Mariana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You might have noticed that our names are the same, but in reverse order. Well, so the title is The Outsider Cities of Gothic Discontinuity. And I'll start by answering Juliet's question, what is in a name, because it's a good question. I'm not referring to the Gothic novel, which rose at the end of the 18th century, where the Gothic means the intrusion of the supernatural, of something abnormal. The Gothic at the end of the 19th century, which is my focus today, is actually legitimated by the scientific theories of heredity, atavism, degeneration, entropy, etc. So I find John Jervis, Transgressing the Modern, 1999, coming in handy at this moment, because he distinguishes between the body of modernity and the Gothic body. So this is the Gothic, that means the breakup with modernity, with the Enlightenment, and even with Romanticism. So the body of modernity is, I think, defined by Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, where he considers that the mind is the unity of the different self-related and self-existent self-consciousnesses. Ego, that is we, a plurality of egos, and we, that is a single ego. So the individual consciousnesses are dissolving into this universal mind, universal spirit, which imbues everything that exists in the world. Unlike it, the Gothic body means a body which transgresses its own limits, dirty, uncontrolled, extended, protruding. And of course, we find a source in Ernst Haeckel, General Morphology of Organism, where he speaks about the differences between the lowest men and animals are less than those between the lowest and the highest man. There is no essential difference between humans and animals. Actually, if the evolution of the embryo stops at some earlier stage in its evolution, then what we get is atavism, an inferior, beastly thing that can be dangerous to humanity. So the theory is destabilizing the self at the end of the 19th century, which is the beginning of this opposition to modernity, the reversal of modernity's meta-narratives, which continued in high modernism and in postmodernism. Atavism, heredity, degeneracy, contact with racial others, everything, therefore, that relates the self to the other in an uncontrolled mode, exposing the self to the others, um, um, to the others' alterity. So the city is discontinuous under two aspects, spatial and temporal, binaries of space. So we are speaking now about divided spaces, conceptually and also empirically. Here we have images of a Victorian mansion, for instance. We can think of Jekyll's elegant house, and the suburbs haunted by Hyde, his double. This is the servants' quarter. So there are masters versus servants. And this is an opposition between an old Victorian mansion and the skyscrapers built in New York, projecting, this image was projected in 1910. That is 2 years after the publication of Henry James's The Jolly Corner. The Jolly Corner, which is the story of an American, Henry James himself, who goes to Europe and returns years later. He's carrying with him the heritage, the cultural heritage of old Europe, and what he finds in America, what has been built in the meantime, is a landscape of frightening skyscrapers. There is no imagination, there is no sensitivity. So he feels as if he had split up into two selves that cannot be reconciled in any way. Of course, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the canonical, let's say, figure of split personality in the late 19th century. Gaps in time. Washington Irving, Rip Van Winkle, William Austin, Peter Rugg, The Missing Man, and Mircea Eliade and the Gypsies. 3 stories with the same plot. That is the character coming back home and not being able to come back home anymore because years have passed in the meantime, and their homes and their acquaintances and families are no longer there. So why was this plot so appealing to all these authors? In Washington Irving, that is the story of a loyal subject to the King of England. So this is a parable of loyalty to the king as being obsolete, as being something that no longer fitted in the normal course of history, no longer looked ahead. Peter Rugg, The Missing Man, the same story, a loyal subject of the king who keeps haunting America with his daughter. And there is even this emphasis upon the end of everything that he represents. His daughter is with him, so removed from actual life existence, spectralized. His house has been pulled down, and even the lot is now put up for auction. So there's nothing that remains behind him. His rug, that is some tissue of no value, of no identity. Mircea Eliade was a historian of religion. He left Romania at the onset of the communist regime, emigrated to France, then to the United States. He was a professor of the history of religion at the University of Chicago for a number of years, more than a decade, I think. And in 1959, when he was away from Romania, he had left Romania for more than a decade, he wrote this story at the Gypsies, the story of a man who teaches piano to children, who is coming back someday. He stops on the way. He goes to a brothel. He meets some women there. One of them is a gypsy, another one is Jewish, and the third is Greek. So facing alterity, and he gets lost when he tries to return home. Nothing is in place any longer. Finally, his former love, since his adolescence, meets him on a car which takes them to the cemetery. So the plot may have been known to Mircea Eliade, the plot which Washington Irving and William Austin had elaborated upon. So this is also a gap in time, the exclusion of something that is outside the culture he inhabited at that time. Of course, this is not royalty, but a story of a provincial marginal society. Jonathan Hart speaks about the poetics of otherness. So this opposition between self and other apparently has become a manner of writing, also of reception, maybe heading towards a new critical theory. So Jonathan Hart says, we bring to the landscape a grammar of our language, a history of culture, and images from our culture. Richard Lagravenese, the writer of The Fisher King, is of Italian ancestry, and like Mircea Eliade, or like Henry James, estranged, who had spent much time in Europe, actually becoming an English subject. He comes to America and he's not completely integrated. He still feels different and also indebted to his cultural roots. His New York, therefore, is not a unitary landscape as it probably appears to natives. It has 4 layers of reality. Reality in its place, à sa place, as Lacan says. So we see here people sitting down to have dinner, caring about table manners, and so on. Reality, which is semiotic, because here we see Jack, the protagonist, who is horrified to know that he unwittingly has caused the death of innocent people by working up a man to killing people of the upper class, of elegant, smart society. Out of this ideological agenda, it's us or them, therefore othering on social reasons, class differences. And he has this Pinocchio doll. It's been given to him, and the child who gave it to him called him a bum. Jack asks the doll, have you read any Nietzsche? Nietzsche, speaking about the master soul and the slave soul. Of course, Pinocchio is the story of a doll which, through good conduct, is finally gratified to become a child, to become human. And this is the story, is a Mizamabima device, because this is the story of Jack, who finally acquires a soul, is humanized by his friendship with his victim. A hybrid space, which is, as we can see, this landscape in New York, of a skyscraper, but also of a tower, which is built in medieval style. The husband of a woman who had been killed in the terroristic attack is a professor of medieval architecture, and he's obsessing with romances like Don Quixote, and also the Grail. He feels the need to be saved, as in the Grail romances. And the imagined reality, which is the Red Knight of his nightmares. But the script writer does not say that this is in all imaginations. He only says, now we see from Paris' perspective. Therefore, we may assume that these two may be real. So this is a phenomenology of perception, not an ontologically certified reality. The poetics of othering. There is the social other. This is a radio talk show, and Jack is addressing a caller. Edwin, I told you about these people. They only mate with their own kind. It's called yuppie inbreeding. That's why so many of them are retarded and wear the same clothes. They are not human. They can't feel love. They can only negotiate love moments. They are evil, Edwin. They are repulsed by imperfection, horrified by the banal, everything America stands for, Edwin. They have to be stopped before it's too late. It's us or them, my emphasis. So this is, these are the words which drive that man who was a timid and inoffensive man to committing that terroristic attack on the upper class gathering in a restaurant. So here we have Jackson which is the body of modernity, handsome, aggressive, intelligent, and Perry, this teacher of medieval architecture, a Gothic patchwork of college teacher, architect, bum, romance, Don Quixote, quotation, psycho, because he was crazed by his wife's violent death. The racial order. So Jack Lucas' story, this may be very well like Gravenis' story. The Italian immigrants speaking pig Italian. Il nova esta fucking pinico. So La Gravenis still feels is casting about for images to illustrate his story, and they are provided by his Italian background. The Irishman is reading a Chaucer passage in Old English. So of course, the Irish, these are cultural stereotypes associated with the Celtic heritage of romances. Black protesting constitutional rights, because Afro-Americans are also obsessing with being persecuted and not granted their legal rights. A hippie who's a universal subculture inhabitant is admiring the Marvel comics displayed by the super bum that is by Perry, the former professor, who has been banished to the basement of the house which he had once inhabited. We've already seen that house. That is the upper store, the elegant mansion, and the basement, which is actually a kind of hell. So this is Gothic paraxial space, Perry's basement. Jack visits it and he notices three levels of reality again. First of all, handmade collage, pictures cut out and pasted in a haphazard manner, all medieval in origin, grassy landscapes with castles, knights, and maidens on horses, and so on. So this is the heritage of medieval romances. On the other hand, on the other side, there is the hell of his nightmarish rider, Red Rider, who is menacing. The style is violent and critic, and this violent image of the Red Knight is being looked at by the Pinocchio doll. So Pinocchio, in this case again, meaning that Gothic discontinuity between animate, inanimate, human, subhuman. Finally, there is this Paris arsenal, that is his weaponry, which is medieval in intent, but of course banal in the stuff he has used. A real textual hybrid underworld, New York and Dante's Inferno. On the one hand, there are images of the New York underworld under Manhattan Bridge or the basement where Perry lives. On the other, there are quotes from Dante, which Perry is producing in front of two youngsters, Perry and Leather. We see them reduced to the name of the garments they wear. They again are like Pinocchio, that is worthless, subhuman. They are violent. They are trying to burn Jack alive. So you see cursed wolf, the fury inward on thyself, pray and consume thee. This is addressed by Virgil to Pluto, the raging ruler of the underworld. Then he addresses the youngsters who are rich, but somehow they are wasting their wealth, and they are compared to the hoarders and wasters in Dante's The Divine Comedy, quoting again, "O pinks blind, what ignorance besets you?" So La Gravenese pities American musicals, Gershwin, "I like new work in June, how about you?" Against his Roman and Italian tradition of the best which has been thought and said, according to Matthew Arnold. A European museum, La Gravenese capitalizes on the European cultural tradition going back to the Middle Ages, unified by the Romance imaginary. The Irishman recites Chaucer, Perry quotes the Divine Comedy, while the Romance of Floire et Blanchefleur refers the audience not only to the Western countries where it was circulated, Italy, France, Spain, but also to the whole Holy Empire and even to ancestral Eastern mythical sources. Mapped onto the New York's landscape, the romantic story, beaming with esoteric meaning, becomes a resonance chamber for the echo of God Pan, that is the whole of the earth and the whole of humanity. So Perry as knight in shining armor, in the name of Blanche de Fleur, unhand that errant knight. Medieval courtly culture, the Knights Templars, the Druid samples of Wales, King Arthur and the Round Table, Parsifal and Lohengrin. And finally, the great teachers of the European initiates, Manes, Sithianos, Buddha, and Zarathustra, the originators of European mysteries of the Rosy Cross, according to Rudolf Steiner, The East and the Light of the West, a lecture dating back to Munich, the 31st of August, 1909. Perry too has a Rosy Cross, but on a garbage cover. They were the originators of the Rosicrucian mysteries. Myths descended into history. Haribert von Laon, maternal grandfather of Charlemagne and founder of the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail, was represented as Floris in the medieval tale Floris and Blanchefleur. A magus of Egypt named Ormus was converted in the year 96 by Saint Mark. He founded the Society of the Sages of Light, to the members of which he gave a red cross as a decoration. About the same time, the Essences and the Jews founded a school of Solomonic wisdom, to which the disciples of Ormus united themselves. The source, Rudolf Steiner again. Edward, the son of Henry III, was received into the society of the Rose-Croix by Raymond Lull. He was crowned as King, Ramon Lull. He was crowned as King Arthur. Sithianos was considered the bodhisattva of the West, that is the enlightenment of being. This is the whole cult of light, the Illuminati, for whom the self is identical with the community. Somehow we are back to Hegel's unity of self and universal spirit. The argument has brought us to a round end. In the 19th century, probably under Schopenhauer's influence, the German Romantic philosophy of the unity of being, sharing in the universal spirit, was replaced with the cosmos artifacts binary. The world is blind will, is Darwinian nature lacking intelligibility, versus the continuum of reified forms of representations. Being acquired negative connotations, taking on grotesque forms ascribed to sexual, racial, or social others. Quantum physics has largely removed the epistemological criterion for the generic definition of the fantastic as the wave function theory, the uncertainty principles, or the localization processes which destabilize eigenstates no longer obey the laws of Newtonian physics. The transgression of boundaries, the primary scene of the fantastic, is no longer seen as ontological, but rather is a clash of identity narratives, which sometimes show some cultural other as irreducible as another planet. When the encounter of clashing narratives is not rendered absolute, there is crossover, a cross-fertilization. The final image of the Fisher King movie shows Perry and Jack lying naked, exposed to the idyllic Central Park in New York. In between them, there is the Pinocchio doll. As Perry, Henri Sagan is the Percival figure, had urged Jack, addressing him as a Virgilian guide's son. Jack has become a man instead of a voice, a face, with or without a body. He has risked his life out of compassion for Perry, has healed the would-be Fisher King, and brought him back to life with the help of a chalice which had once been given as a Christmas gift to billionaire Carmichael in his childhood. The happy end is a mise en abîme of a Christmas miracle. The two protagonists have exorcised the non-human difference symbolized by the doll, which had been grafted on their Gothic hybrid bodies. For Jack, the doll had symbolized the lack in humaneness. For Perry, his fear of the Red Knight. Tamed, freed from his eerie connotations, the doll is lying between them, as harmless as it appears to Pinocchio, the child in Caldo Collodi's book.
Thank you, Maria. Sorry. Thank you, Mariana, for your very in-depth presentation. And I think now we have Elizabeth Abele, and her presentation is titled Celebrating a Forbidden Love, The Shape of Water as a Protest Love Story. And after 20 years of teaching and research, Elizabeth has recently joined the faculty of the Gulf University for Science and Technology. Her work revolves around intersections of American film and literature with gender and race, on which her most recent essay titled The Healing Promise of Adoptions, Revisiting a Foundational American Myth Through News of the World is forthcoming with the Journal of American Studies in Turkey. And the floor is yours, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. It was really wonderful to be able to attend sessions of the conference as I prepared my essay. So thank you for everything about this forum. So celebrating a forbidden love, the shape of water as a protest love story. I'm not sure what that means, so I'm going to go ahead. When Guillermo del Toro saw The Creature from the Black Lagoon as a child, he thought it was a romance, expecting the two would end up together. What to put in the movie, the reversal, to make the image of the creature carrying a beautiful, carrying a girl, a beautiful one, as opposed to a horror image. Del Toro's films have always been steeped in the Gothic, revealing the marginalized in the past that infect the visible present. With The Shape of Water, he presents a fable of crossing ethnic, national, gender, and species boundaries, embracing instead love and acceptance. Del Toro strategically placed this fairy tale romance in 1962 Baltimore, the intersection of US military, civil rights, and the Cold War. At this time, Baltimore's Civic Interest Group was actively organizing protests in Cambridge on the Eastern Shore, which was still largely segregated. Though Baltimore had a few gay bars, arrests were common and unquestioned. Del Toro evokes the civil rights tension of an agent representing the space race and the Cold War. This historical context adds Gothic undertones to the forbidden love story at the center. Like his hero, Del Toro's princess defies expectations. Eliza is a foundling and a mute, bearing the scars of her early abuse. Yet she finds joy in her life with her friends, her shoes, and her daily orgasm. Her friendship likewise crosses boundaries. Zelda is Black and Giles is gay, yet both accept her, ably reading her sign language. Working as a night cleaner in a government lab, she is first to recognize the man within the asset. Drawing on Gothic tropes, Del Toro presents invisible figures that defy the restrictions of 1960s Maryland to celebrate an unimaginable love, giving hope to all. With his rich textual references, intersections, and hidden subtext, Del Toro fashions original fairy tale archetypes that embody new protagonists that resist previous patriarchal and racial boundaries. The River Below. The Shape of Water opens with the lush dream sequence of a flooded apartment with this voiceover. If I spoke about it, if I did, what would I tell you? I wonder, would I tell you about the time? It happened a long time ago, it seems, and the last days of a fair prince's reign. Or would I tell you about else? Or I don't know. Would I tell you about her, the princess without voice? Or perhaps I would just warn you about the truth of these facts and the tale of love and loss and the monster who tried to destroy it all. 1950s monster movies, like The Creature of the Black Lagoon, drew their horror from the repressed fears of the Cold War, sexuality, and race. In his reversal from a horror film to a romance, Del Toro deliberately chose to set his film at the intersections of these fears, making both the subtext and the repressions more visible. Despite the reign of the fair Prince Kennedy, racial protests in Baltimore and elsewhere were more likely to be met with violence than with progress. Though Baltimore is described as a small city near the coast but far from everything else, it is still within the reach of the Pentagon and the industrial military complex. The action of the film ends October 10th, 1962, days before the Cuban Missile Crisis. The social and political context with the supporting characters. Eliza's neighbor Giles is a closeted gay man in his 60s whose alcoholism lost him his advertising job. Her best friend and co-worker Zelda is a married Black woman who works with Eliza in the underground government laboratory. The lead scientist is Dr. Robert Postetler, and he is dedicated to the care and understanding of the amphibian, but he's also the Soviet agent Dmitri. Their nemesis Strickland is the government agent who brought the amphibian from the Amazon, yet he is also an overcompensating family man. So this Baltimore laboratory presents the intersection of the Soviet and US military industry complexes, who believe the asset may provide an advantage in the space race as women. However, the characters of this film live in active denial of their political reality. Mitchell and Snyder explained that hypertextuality creates resistance to the constructs assumed of canonical literary fairy tales. Del Toro often balances his borrowing from fairy tales with popular culture references, but none so much as in The Shape of Water. Eliza and Giles shared the upstairs space of a failing third-run movie theater, currently showing The Story of Ruth. Giles exclusively watches 1930s, 40s musicals, escaping the social tensions that could be found in 1950s horror, spy, or social problem films. Robinson's stair dance with Shirley Temple. Though Giles notes how hard that was to dance, he glides over how Robinson's innovations were stolen by James Cagney and Hollywood as a whole. When Eliza turns on the news, showing the civil rights protest, Giles tells her to change the channel. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see it. Instead, they settle on Betty Grable dancing with a costumed horse, another mixed couple. However, these escapist texts that Del Toro places on television or the movie theater next door contain images of resistance and integration, even while Giles and others glide over those messages, preferring the comforting narratives. Significantly, as the narrator of the story, Giles is the figure most trapped in his self-loathing and denial. The night after the amphibian arrives, Giles takes Eliza to breakfast at a pie shop, where Giles is carrying on a desperate flirtation with a younger counterman, despite how unappetizing the pie is, almost as bad as the toupee. On a later visit to the counter, his crush harshly turns away a Black couple from sitting at the empty counter, followed by Giles' meek, "You didn't have to be so mean." But just a few minutes later, Giles is likewise banned from the restaurant when the pie guy realizes Giles' intentions. This is a family restaurant. Giles may quietly applaud resistant figures like Alice Faye, but he generally supports the status quo as he draws advertisements for happy family life despite his quietly desperate existence. Del Toro strategically places his lovers at a point in US history that was socially and politically volatile, at the same time that many Americans were actively in denial of those tensions, as well as the existence of people not visible on television American. As Michael Atkinson notes, new section, Love Cannot Speak. As Michael Atkinson notes, all Del Toro's films are fairy tales, even when they're science fiction, horror, science fantasy, or some coyote admixture therein. His sensibility is Grimsian, born of urban Mexican culture, steeped in native arts, craft, poverty, civil discontent, and American pop. Though his couple may have been inspired by a monster image, his love story evokes classic fairy tale figures, most strikingly the Little Mermaid and the Frog Prince. In her discussion of Pan's Labyrinth, Christine Kotecki notes how an older form approximating a newer one can produce an innovative effect. While Del Toro's canonical models were hybrid beings striving to become human, this tale celebrates their differences and the sea. Rather than Eliza being a sweet and innocent girl, she's a complicated word day, which begins at 9 p.m. by boiling eggs and then using the timer to masturbate in the bath. She also has an appetite for stylish footwear, eyeing high heels on the way to work. Likewise, she prefers to wear the color red over pastels. While the mermaid traded her voice to the sea witch for legs, Eliza's voice was stolen by her family, who then abandoned her. Like the mermaid, she was found by the river. Yet she again does not fit into the model of the sweet orphan. She has no qualms about being late to work and breaking in line to clock in. When Strickland makes a pass at her and insults her, she fuck you. But she most subverts expectations in her recognition and pursuit of her prince. Instead of being the subject of her prince's gaze, waiting for him, Eliza is unabashedly curious from the moment the amphibian arrives. Even after she learns the dangerous potential of the amphibian, she and Zelda clean the aftermath of his attack on Strickland, she is not deterred. While Zelda is rattled by the blood, Eliza approaches the amphibian's tank, placing her hand against the glass. He is the one who retreats. Throughout the film, Eliza pursues the amphibian. She first seduces him with hard-boiled eggs, showing little fear when he rises fully from the pool or shrieks. On her next visit, she adds music to her pursuit. Rather than the beast reassuring the beauty or calm carrying her off, Eliza for his rescue. One thing that unites Eliza and the amphibian across species is their apparent voicelessness. Her voice was taken a while he is limited to gurgles. But their lack of traditional speech is ironic, as they may be the most comfortable in expressing their needs and who they are. David T. Mitchell and Sharon L. Snyder describe that while voicelessness is often regarded as a metaphor for political powerlessness, this film presents complex crypt and queer embodiments over metaphors of voicelessness. Political powerlessness obviously silences Zelda and Giles, but white men Strickland and Hostetler are likewise silenced by their precarious positions within patriarchal order. When the asset disappears, General Hoyt threatens Strickland with exile, with being unborn. Not only do Strickland and the general ignore Dr. Hostetler's pleas on behalf of the scientific and individual value of the Dimitri. On the other hand, Eliza teaches the amphibian to speak through sign language. Her sign language in several instances gives her a voice not available to others. While Giles and Zelda see the amphibian as other, Eliza sees them as fated by their shared difference. When Giles calls the amphibian a thing and therefore not worthy of rescue, Eliza questions his definition of human. What am I? I move my mouth like him. I make no sound like him. What does that make me? All that I am, all that I've ever been, brought me here to him. When he looks at me, the way he looks at me, he does not see what I am as I am. I can either save him or let him die. Like Romeo and Juliet, The Shape of Water is a love story that serves to transform the community left behind by the persecuted lovers. Through them, Giles, Zelda, and Dimitri found their voices. Before Eliza's heroic example, it would not have occurred to any of them to break the law, despite how poorly the law has treated them. Dmitri gave his life for his chance to speak, brutalized by agents of both the Soviet and US government. However, Giles and Zelda remain in their marginalized communities, but now with a voice to speak against their oppression as well as against the oppression of others. Eliza has revealed herself to be their princess, with Strickland the monster, not the authority, who has been killed for his mistake. Mermaid does not die, and the Frog Prince does not become human. Her love and sacrifice restores the amphibian's strength, which he uses to save her life. To get from their apartment to the canal, Giles and Eliza had to half carry the amphibian, where they are overtaken by Strickland, who shoots both the amphibian and Eliza. However, the amphibian is able to heal himself, confronting Strickland and slashing him across the throat, mirroring Eliza's scars. It is at this point that he picks Eliza up in his arms, in the Black Lagoon pose, jumping into the canal. As he kisses her, holding her neck, she revives and breathes through her new gills. Some have interpreted this as proof that Eliza was never human, making her more like the mermaid. With the amphibian, either way, the amphibian is more the prince who awakens sleeping beauty than the Frog Prince. Neither the Frog Prince nor the Little Mermaid in Del Toro's version want to be human. They enhance their differences and each other, finding a better place to live. As a child, Del Toro instinctively saw the power in the image of a hybrid man carrying the distressed woman. By choosing 1962, Del Toro not only places this final image as an argument for mixed race marriages, Maryland only repealed its miscegenation law in 1967, but he argues for recognizing humanity in all marginalized people. The monster Strickland makes frequent comments against the humanity of non-whites and non-Americans, comments strangely echoed by Giles early in the film. In her reading of Crimson Peak, Evelanga Kinzinger argues, the real horror Del Toro suggests are not the ghosts of patriarchy, because it traumatizes women and turns them into ghosts and monsters. Eliza refuses to be haunted by her past trauma or by men like Strickland, empowering everyone to reject the monster who tried to destroy it all. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have our last presentation of the day by John Mark Wilson Borrell. Bloodletting, an overview of thematic alienation and xenophobia from software's Bloodborne. John is currently teaching at Southeastern Louisiana University. He works on remediation, experimental 21st century literature, media studies, memory studies, and trauma theory. He is a member of the MLA and the Spanish Association for American Literature. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you guys today. Let me go ahead and share the screen. All righty. And I'm not as used to Zoom. I'm more used to Google Meet. All right. Why is this not going? Oh, there we are. Sorry about that little technical hiccup. From Software, a Japanese company renowned for making innovative, genre-creating games, notably the Dark Souls franchise, amongst other titles that have furthered the gaming industry in terms of artistic and cultural merit, displays perhaps their most Gothic-inspired creation in a 2015 game entitled Bloodborne. Though the term game does not fully encapsulate the artistic merits of this title, as the term is often misleadingly associated with a derision reserved for achievements of lesser artistic merit, that is a discussion best reserved for another time. Therefore, when the term game is used throughout this presentation, it is in hopes of elevating the medium to a state of rightful and meaningful consideration, or at the very least, to remove some of the associated stigma when discussing a game in academic contexts. Hidetaka Miyazaki is the director of Bloodborne. He also serves as the main creative influence on the majority of the titles From Software produces. Miyazaki, though drawing from several other key authors in the field, primarily pays homage to themes and concepts present in H.P. Lovecraft's relatively niche oeuvre. The player character controls an avatar referred to as a hunter during their sojourn in the oniric, perverse world called Yharnam. Yharnam is a reflection of a plague-ridden England, as noted by the accents various characters employ, the architecture, attire, diction, and overall aesthetic. It is less than coincidental that the art direction is mimetic of a carnivalesque Victorian society, replete with social stratification and a dependence on technological innovation that in turn pollutes its urban setting. This plague is the result of a so-called healing church that claims to have stumbled upon a panacea after doing occult experiments that consist of extracting blood from eldritch great ones. This blood transforms the residents of Yharnam alongside the inhabitants of subsequent areas into beastly abominations in more mild cases and into horrifically altered figures that defy the natural order of the world in the most severe ones. This alleged panacea, which is an injection of blood from an unknowable other, is the catalyst for a catastrophic event which disrupts their society, causing it to decline to the point of unsustainability or apocalypse. The hunter is perpetually an outsider in Yharnam. The Yharnamite traditions are foreign, alien, and appear savage. This is related to how some ethnicities are treated by dominant cultures, yet paradoxically, the hunter is more of an ethnic other in this Gothic setting, as they can never be fully integrated into the culture of Yharnam, nor can they fathom the Great Ones. Ultimately, that is the quest the hunter undergoes, to ascend to the level of a Great One. While for Lovecraft, the eldritch horrors displays humanity's insignificance in the cosmos, in Bloodborne, they may be understood as the impossible integration or acceptance amongst a dominant race, class, or in this case, species for an outside other. The various inhabitants of Yharnam range from beastly in nature to unfathomable to the human mind, referred to as eldritch great ones or kin of the great ones. Lovecraft's mythos is repurposed in the context of both the narrative and in-game mechanics. Insight, a measure of one's exposure to the hidden horrors residing in their world, is also an indication of one's madness. This measure of greater occult knowledge in regards to inherently unknowable entities enables the ability to see eldritch horrors that are not necessarily hidden in plain sight. They coexist on the other side of the veil. Roy Boyne in Foucault and Derrida, The Other Side of Reason states, quote, "There is a great line of cleavage in the Western experience of madness. On the one hand, madness is inexplicable and holds out the threat of dark and unknown regions. On the other hand, madness is explicable. It is foolishness and illusion, a condition of error which has some prior cause. The line of cleavage, then, is between the other and the same, between the transcendental and the empirical, between the sublime and the mundane, between fear and control, and ultimately, perhaps between the bright hope of difference and the monotony of bourgeois reason. This madness relegates the hunter to witnessing the underlying causality for the decay of the once thriving civilization. In comprehending the driving forces of the other, albeit to a relatively small degree, does not become a catalyst for integration. Rather, it is a means of further alienation. The hunter is part of this world, though they do not belong to a particular demographic, inhabiting a type of cultural liminal space without resolution. Perhaps this formulates part of the inherent madness the hunter experiences as an ethnic other. Interestingly, the player may choose what race and gender, though only a binary selection is available in creating their avatar. Players may also choose distinctly inhuman skin tones as if they prefer to sidestep identifying with a particular race or ethnicity. The aforementioned plague leads Yarnamites to massacre their fellow citizens. However, there is a clear mob mentality in this culture. Only those that become more affected of this plague, thus breaking from the mainstream or acceptable levels of aberration, are hunted down. They are visually represented as either more beastly or more akin to the eldritch great ones. This too is not begotten from happenstance. It is those with the most societal influence and power, like the higher choir of the healing church or the scholars of a defunct college, that are the most severely affected, denoting a break from the mainstream culture or average Yarnamite leads to peril and ruin. In Bloodborne, there is a subversion of traditional presentation of chronotropes, meaning that the hunter is able to experience various psychological planes and manifestations of the past as if entering a distorted cultural and collective historical memory. One such instance is simply referred to as the Fishing Hamlet. This nameless villa is, with little doubt, highly inspired by Lovecraft's The Shadow of Innsmouth. To arrive at the Fishing Hamlet, the hunter must traverse a distorted version of Yarnam's past called the Hunter's Nightmare. This creates a reflection within a reflection, or more accurately, a series of myths in a being that create further layers of distancing for the hunter or player. Verily, the hunter becomes lost in both the horrors they face and the abyssal chasm of breaching a cultural understanding with the residents. Lovecraft writes, quote, "Several non-residents had reported monstrous glimpses from time to time, but between old Zadok's tales and the malformed denizens, it was no wonder such illusions were current. None of the non-natives ever stayed out late at night, there being widespread impression that it was not wise to do so. Besides, the streets were loathsomely dark," end quote. The inhospitality towards the other in Lovecraft's text stems from a mistrust towards outsiders, illustrating a pervasive sense of xenophobia. This is also the case in Bloodborne, yet it was the first hunters, long before the player arrives, that caused the initial transgression. Much like colonizers, the first hunters conquered the initially passive village, since a great one washed upon their shores. Given that colonialization is an ongoing process, the residents adopted many of the customs of these first hunters. Furthermore, these hunters, who were trained in science, at least occult sciences, by the healing church, experimented on the residents. These experiments further mutated the natives of the Fishing Hamlet that were already affected by the presence of a great one. This underscores the influence of outsiders on a relatively closed socio-political and ecological environment. As the arrival of the hunters caused wanton suffering, the locals, in turn, are openly hostile towards any potential outsiders. Eileen Chris and Helen Kopmana, in their article entitled "Unsettling Anthropocentrism," poses an interesting rhetorical question, stating, quote, "In an article titled RoboChop, The Economist reported a practical problem and its technological solution. The problem was that swarms of jellyfish clogged up the pipes of a Swedish nuclear power plant on the Baltic Sea coast, forcing the plant's temporary shutdown. The proposed solution involved utilizing an invention of a fleet of killer robots that turned jellyfish into mush. The devices, known as JEROS, Jellyfish Elimination Robotic Swarms, are designed to follow a lead robot and work in formation. They can apparently chop up 900 kilometers of jellyfish an hour. The report raises an irrepressible question. Is there not something wrong, even deeply disturbing about this picture? Questioning anthropocentrism is far more than an academic exercise of debating the dominant cultural motif of placing humans at the center of material and ethical concerns. It is a fertile way of shifting the focus of attention away from the problem symptoms of our time, be these symptoms as far-reaching as rapid climate change or as inconvenient as just jellyfish jamming the machine, to the investigation of root causes, and certainly dominant beliefs, values, and attitudes guiding human action constitute a significant driver of the pressing problems of our day, end quote. In this scenario, the inhabitants of the fishing hamlet are initially treated like a nuisance to be eradicated or experimented on, like so many jellyfish in the Baltic Sea. Though they are native, their customs and traditions have been warped by outside influences, defamiliarizing themselves, losing their humanity, and rendering them particularly alien to outsiders. Though the player-hunter may encompass some of the cultural legacies of their forebears, the integration of those mores into the society of the fishing hamlet has become so foreign that the hunter feels perpetually unwelcome there and in a near constant state of having harm caused upon their person. The transgression is not the players, yet they have become an outsider due to the institutions they initially represent. Placing one's particular culture at the center of action, disregarding desires of indigenous populations, is easily noted as a common characteristic of imperial cultures, yet it also remains a persistent question in anthropocentrism. That word always trips me up, sorry about that. As Yarnum is a distorted vision of Victorian England, it also maintains the unpleasant aspects of forming a formidable empire. It is often overlooked that Welsh in Old English means foreigner or stranger. This nomenclature is a strategy created to cause a state of dissonance for the indigenous Welsh population that feel like strangers in their own land, an all too common condition in othering. It is by no coincidence that the one character the hunter comes across that presents as Scottish, given her accent, is charged with removing hunters that have been overly swayed by the beastly plague. Eileen the Crow, with her thick affectations and noticeably different diction, takes her solemn task as a form of service that must be done, lest the aberrant hunters become consumed by bloodlust, turning into beasts in the process. Her duty places her as an ethnic other, one of her defining characteristics being Scottish, and yes, let's face it, dressing like a crow, disallows her from fully integrating in the loosely affiliated group of hunters. She must hunt the hunters that have strayed too far from their humanity. Like a Scottish avenging angel of death or mercy, she performs her undesirable service of killing hunters. Throughout the player's tenure in the game, the vast majority of the characters are hostile towards the foreign agent, the aforementioned hunter. Yet there are a handful of expectations to this. There are individuals that grant shelter or some typically minor form of assistance in the arduous task of navigating the savage streets of Yarnum. One of these characters resides in a realm outside of Yarnum in a type of non-space, or perhaps a liminal space called the hunter's dream. This dream delivers succor and respite and is paradoxically one of the few areas where the hunter is not in peril. That is for the vast majority of the game. This is paradoxical as the act of sleeping leaves one prone and vulnerable as they are not conscious of their surroundings, nor is one able to adequately react to threats presented in their environment. It is in this eerily placid liminal state of existence where the hunter encounters and interacts with the doll. The doll is a puppet of sorts, though acts through her own volition, sentience through insight, arcane secrets related to the interworking of the presented universe of Bloodborne. The doll is modeled after a former huntress named Lady Maria. Lady Maria is also considered an outsider to a degree, given her unusually large height, cursed bloodline that we cannot fully engage with here, and her almost otherworldly beauty. While Lady Maria is a fierce and formidable huntress, the doll is far more subservient, meek in nature. While this makes for an interesting dichotomy that deserves examination, particularly within a feminist context, the doll's presence in a hunter's dream furthers the notion that this space resides outside of chronological time and space, altering the accepted limitations, metaphysical laws, and principles of physics that govern the outside world of Yarnum. These laws and limitations mirror, to a significant degree, the outside world of the game. It is here that the hunter, free from the precarious hunt in Yarnum, that they gain acceptance. Within this dream, idyllic in its lack of violence, the hunter is no longer treated as a foreign invader, an other, but rather as an integral part of society with a solemn task to perform. The doll frequently ends her interactions with the hunter with the phrase, "May you find your worth in the waking world." It is notable that it is in a dream that acceptance is granted while the threat of extermination exists in waking. The doll's phrase implies an understanding that she is cognizant of the hunter's status in Yarnum. It becomes incumbent upon the hunter to discover their own self-worth rather than acceptance by the mob, a likely impossible given the cultural attitudes and hostility of all but a few denizens of Yarnum. Through slumber, the hunter may dream of a peaceful life, yet this is not what occurs. In one of many subversions, returning to the dream, either through death of the hunter or by using an item referred to as a hunter's mark or bold hunter's mark, the screen asks the player if they wish to reawaken. Therefore, the dream is a psychological plane, a realm of higher consciousness, which is removed from the deeper levels of consciousness associated with deep REM sleep. Yarnum is the nightmare. The hunter's dream is a higher plane where acceptance of the other is commonplace, despite the potential associated peculiarities and idiosyncrasies of the individual. The hunter relies on the doll, despite her oddities. She acts as a surrogate maternal figure. In Bloodborne, a so-called other may awaken from the dehumanizing practice of othering, finding release in higher planes of consciousness. Outside of Bloodborne, finding one's worth in the waking world as an ethnic other is, lamentably, not so easily achieved. For the hunter, an ethnic other, the cycle of waking in a hostile dystopia is perhaps not the distorted mirror of the outside world one may have initially hoped. At the risk of sounding preachy, may we all find each other's worth in our waking world. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your very interesting presentations. Now we can start our Q&A session. So if the public has any questions, you can raise your hand and I will call your name and you can turn on your camera and microphone if you want to ask your question directly to our speakers, or you can type it in the chat if you do not feel like turning on your camera. And while we see if we have some bold participant that wants to ask a question, I would break the ice, commenting briefly on your presentations. And of course, if you want to ask questions between yourselves, you can, of course, if your fellow presenters raise some issues that you want to address. I thought it was very interesting that all of your presentation, despite being so different and about such different texts, I think it was very interesting that all of you touched upon intersectionality that seemed to be a fundamental element in all of your texts. So these characters that are outsiders in a way, or they cannot integrate, or they're not welcome in society. They all have more than one characteristic that makes them unwelcome. So they may be just because of ethnic reasons, also sexuality, gender, and whatnot. So I thought that was really interesting. And somehow, despite such different texts, the presentations somehow were in communication. And I also thought that it's very interesting how all of them were about actual whether physical or imagined, but monsters, a monstrous body. That is, I think, in particular in my favorite thing are monsters. It's very interesting how the protagonist feels that she self-represents as a monster to go through life. She feels that that's her way to cope with the society in which she's trying to fit in, or she's trying to find a place somehow. So I think this was very interesting. And if you have any comments, I see that Elizabeth already has one. So please share it. You're muted.
Okay. Well, you were talking about the monstrous bodies, and what I thought connected Stephen's work and my work was the fact that the bodies may be perceived as monstrous, but the texts actually argue that they're not. And so that the monstering is in some ways a way of othering. And then his connection of that to not just the way people look, but also what their job is. I found to be, quite interesting as well. And I see Stephen raised his hand up as well. So I think he might also have something to say further about his text, where again, monster may be the term, but it's not necessarily who they are. So I'll give the floor to Stephen.
Okay, let me put down my hand first, which I always is. So I just want to carry on with what Elizabeth was saying. Is that what I think what's kind of interesting about the film, which I think is very, very close to my favorite thing is Monsters, in terms of the kind of work that it's doing, is it's not only that these works are representing intersectionality, but they're also constituting it. They're constitutive of this new movement. What I mean by that is that the works aren't simply registering marginalization of people who are outside of the dominant, but actually are formulating an emergent and alternative formation. It's not simply registering disempowerment, but it's the groundwork for what's turning out to be, I think, a new significant and possibly dominant form in the future. And so that's what makes them significant. It's not simply that it's otherness or outsideness, but it's what we're seeing, particularly in the moment with horror and Gothic and science fiction, and which I think a genre I think is best understood not as a list of typological formations or plots, but as works which did not fit within the classic formulation of the novel being one of the great cultural achievements of centrist liberalism and its attempt to manage these binaries and divisions. And so for me, genre is unnovel activity, which is one reason why we see it in games and graphic narratives and televisual materials rather than the literaries. And so for my favorite thing is Monsters, one of its projects is a revision of history, in that when she first made the pitch, or when they first made the pitch for the book, what's significant for Ferris is, among all the other multivalences aspect of what it means to be a werewolf, is Kurt Siduak, the German Jewish scriptwriter for The Wolfman and The Mummy and many of the sort of the what are now considered the classic 1940s horror films. And one of the things she points out is that Siduak based the werewolf on Jewish experience, and that the pentagram is his version of the Judenstern, the yellow star. And that's very key to this narrative because it involves a cassette recording of a Holocaust survivor. And so history isn't simply traumatic, but it's also generative. That trauma is generative for a new kind of shape. And I think this is one of the ways in which it's a kind of post-camp formulation, because it's not simply registering, oh, there's another group of people like me out there. It's actually forming a new kind of society and making a bid for this kind of society to be a form of the dominant. And that's what I think is key about the kinds of works that we're seeing in the current moment through a variety of media. and what do we put into it? So yeah, I think I would just sort of tack on that everything that Elizabeth said I agree with, but I want to raise the stakes even more to say this isn't just something that like a group of us out there what we're seeing is the eggshell breaking of a post-liberal society, and all the conceptual terms and social terms that we've been operating with for a long time, 200 years, 150 years, we're in the process of reformulating a conceptual category. And the engine for that is the kind of works that people were talking about today.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. And I do have a question for John, but I will just follow for a moment on what you were saying. It made me think, your presentation in particular, it reminded me of a couple of different things. For example, the concept that I think Natalie Wilson, but I don't want to mention people at random, that talks about willful monstrosity. So this kind of monstrosity that it's willful to be a monster, a subversive monster, a monster that is transgressive, that is not, it's maybe a new type of Gothic monster. It's not a Gothic monster that at the end we go back to the conservatism that started at the beginning, but it's a monster that wants to challenge that. And at the same time, also, it for some reason, probably because the protagonist of your comic book is also a Latina, partially, it reminded me of that it's a bit of a draft, a hint of a Latinx monster theory that does Calvo Quiroz, that says that the Latino body and the Latin in general, Latinx subject, has been constructed as a social monster. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the Latinx subject produces monsters that are connected to neoliberalism and peculiar moments of crisis. So, for example, we have the chupacabras that's been created in the mid-90s, when there was certain kind of politics towards both border politics, but also in general, a resurgence of some nativist type of discourses. So I think that it's very interesting because I just love that this girl depicts herself as a monster. And there are a few moments in which the people are telling her, you're not a monster. And she's seeing herself as a monster because that's her way to cope with it. And I think that's absolutely interesting. And I do agree that maybe we do need this kind of monsters, this kind of different interpretation of what a monster is and what a monster can do.
Yeah. Well, in Doctoral's opening, he basically has that line, and the monster who destroyed it all. And you don't really know until the film's going along that he's talking about the white guy, the handsome, perfect guy.
Yeah.
And so that he has none of the other features or marginalizations of the other characters. In some ways, it's kind of like, how people now want to say that Frankenstein, Victor's the monster. So again, that retelling of it all.
And I want to let John have a chance to say it, but I'll just quickly we can call a willful monstrosity or elective affinity or fellow traveler or allyship. What's interesting and significant is everything that you've said, but even further, because what we're seeing in a lot of contemporary global Gothic horror and weird is not the notion that the others all have to be the same, but that a coalition of interests. So we can look at something like Lovecraft Country or The Terror Season 2, where we're seeing BIPOC turns to local supernaturalism that don't have to be converged into one thing, but they're different, but they're working in coalition, right? So in other words, Lovecraft Country is, the not to give away the plot, but it's the Korean Black American alliance, groups that were previously pitted against one another, helping each other. Or in The Season Terror 2, we see Japanese American and Latinx communities, the supernaturals of the world, sort of forming a kind of alliance, Avengers League coming together. And that's I think what makes it slightly different. In other words, it's not just like everybody is just another. It's that particularity is maintained, but there's an alliance, there's a coalition against liberal pluralism or consensual pluralism. Sorry, John, over to you.
Oh, you're fine. You guys handled that very well. I agree with your points, very much so. I would like to add on, though, that in these formations, these constructions of monstrosity, oftentimes it seems, particularly in a 21st century context and late 20th century context, that while earlier forms of it did share some of these seeds and these vestiges, that these days that it's not the monster as a particular individual, but rather it is societal traditions and cultures and attitudes. So while we have the other as no longer a monolithic type of entity to just be fully dehumanized, we're investigating these stories and these different forms of media in which that they're giving these different shades and differences and this new life to them. So it can help create this further understanding into the inner workings and agencies of the other, and hopefully thereby less so othering them. But it really highlights this idea that these deeply steeped systems, traditions, and cultures are perhaps the true monster, and it points the finger in very uncomfortable places, oftentimes to familial places, to the family. So it's not so much that the monster is hiding under your bed, it's what your parents tell you. Your parents, in that sense, are the ones that are indoctrinating you into believing and seeking out these monsters in society. And that's the part that feels uncomfortable, because our parents, our families, our friends, our kin, they're supposed to be that blanket of security, that sense of understanding, familiarity. But they're the ones that oftentimes lead to us seeing others as unfamiliar, as other, as aberrant. So it becomes overly easy to fall into this mob mentality. And oftentimes it's this ignorance, but it's a very particular type of ignorance, one that's enculturated rather than just ignorance for not knowing. It's actually a taught ignorance, which is quite paradoxical, that creates this profound othering of different demographics. And therefore those people become outsiders, not necessarily because of gender, ethnicity, and race, but simply because the mainstream culture was taught to other them. They've learned these traditions. They got it from their parents, their grandparents, their friends. And that's the really interesting aspect of these stories. On a side note, I really enjoyed your connections with The Little Mermaid and The Shape of Water. That was quite fascinating. And how we've seen that story before, of how the real monster is kind of humanity, and the monster can point out that, oh, they're more human than us at times, but it does serve to underscore some of the particular things that humans do, that humanity in general does, that oftentimes without thinking about it can diminish the presence of another, or we don't fully realize how we interact with ourselves in particular and with each other.
I was struck with those images you were showing, that they were hybrid, again, they were hybrid sea creatures. And there was something so beautiful about them, while at the same time, those that didn't have feet were then could be chewed up. So again, there were those, again, the hybridity struck me as existing also in Shape of Water.
And I always tend to prefer that type of imagery that comes from our own oceans, that we see as so foreign, even though it's on our planet. I always kind of find that such an interesting subversion. Oh, it's inhuman, therefore it's so other. It's like, oh, we're still part of the same planet in a way. Well, not in a way, definitely.
Yeah, well, I do have a question for you, John, but first we do have a question from a public. Laura?
Hi. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah,
Okay, so actually my question ties in very well with John's answer just now, because I was thinking about what you've been speaking about, this change in the way that the monster is represented and approached, and how we're trying to represent the other in a different way to maybe come closer to that monster, to a better understanding of what that monster represents or who that monster is. And I was thinking about this from the perspective of the audience, what John was mentioning about this mob mentality, and we've been speaking a lot about in politics recently about our political and cultural anxieties are very focused these days on the polarization of society and this type of questions. So I was wondering, from the perspective of the audience who's consuming these cultural products, these Gothic cultural products, do you think they're likely to go with it, to actually engage in this approaching and coming closer and to an understanding of others, and will this trend from the perspective of the creators, will this trend continue in this sense of trying to represent the perspective of the monster as in an empathic way, so to speak? Or will this trend, because of this polarization in the audience and maybe a bad response from the audience in this sense, and not trying to understand this monster, will it return to something else, to being a more threatening monster that we do not want to understand?
That's a very interesting question. On the one hand, to dismantle these things, it does seem to have to occur from the individual level. And while it is difficult to project where media is going to take us in 15, 20 years, the current state of it, we have so much coming out that we do have these smaller stories that focus on the microcosmic interactions between the individual subject with what could be perceived as a monstrous other, and the subversions between the two, the different layers of discrepancies between the two. And we have the larger ones, these unknowable massive entities on a societal scale, and they come out in droves each year, side by side. So as I mentioned, while it's difficult to see how this will carry forward, it is interesting to note that horror and Gothic has always been about challenging societal perceptions. It's a highly experimental form. So even in its early days, centuries ago, it was very much about challenging these preconceptions. And we can even recently in the 80s and 90s slasher films that we see, oh, we have this monstrous serial killer that kills people in the woods. But if you look at the victims, the African-American dies first. Well, because Hollywood can be a little racist. Then we have the fun girl who's the cheerleader, and she has to die because she engaged in premarital sex. Then we have the guy that dies next because, oh no, he smoked a joint while he was in college or drank too much. But who tends to survive to the end? Oh, the virginal good girl that dresses as if she was about to go away to Mormon sleepaway camp. And a lot of this can be looked at from both sides to more directly engage with your question. So while this media is out there, it's still up to the individual and their perceptions of how they engage with it. Some people may look at the slasher film, to use a simple example, and look at it as they got their just comeuppance. They, did something they shouldn't have, and society punished them justly so. Where other people may look at it and see it as a type of overblown Christian panic, of this very deep morality that not everyone shares. Some do, some do not. So while these stories are being presented, oftentimes when it leaves the creator's hands, the interpretations are up to the subject, really, and how people interact and respond to them. I'm not sure if that directly answers your question, because it was quite a big question. You touch upon a lot of interesting things, but I'm going to pass it off to my colleague here.
Okay, I'll just briefly. So, John said John, I think, said that's a very, very nice formulation, what he had said slightly earlier, which is the change that's happening is that horror used to be about the body of the other, and it is now horror is about the ideology of the dominant. And that's what in some ways, I think, is the real change that's going on, is that the horrible is the center. And in an age when the liberal novel has failed, that is to say, the sort of rational critical public sphere, horror has become the place that's carrying the mantle for anti-fascist cultural opposition. So critical race theory is the theory, and horror and Gothic and weird is the practice. And so, when we're looking for where alternatives to the rise of the right wing, horror and Gothic and weird, or whatever key term you want to use, is one of the main places of cultural production that's going on, because this is where the critique of the monstrosity of the norm and the monstrosity of the liberal consensus is being unraveled.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, we are keeping on seeing new horror products that do challenge, and I think maybe in past decades it was more difficult to access this kind of products, but now, I mean, I can make a video and it can be shared globally. So of course it takes I guess a totally different weight in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was precisely what I was thinking. If this is a way that a practice, a fictional practice where we can express this fight against the far right movement, if this is something that's gonna, as other type of more, say, grassroots movements have received such great backlash, if you were feeling that this kind of fictional expression of that could also receive this type of backlash in that sense. So thank you for your answers.
Elizabeth, you're muted.
Trying to be polite and all that. But one of the things that, again, I was sort of seeing tying a lot of our work together that might be a little bit different from horrors, if we think of the 80s and 50s, is the fact that history is important, and that it's not enough to just critique where we are right now, but that these horror films deliberately remind us to go back and to look. And again, the more that I've looked at Del Toro's work, I was very impressed by the fact that he's dealing with a history that is not even his own. But even still, how important he felt that grounding was to the film that he wanted to do.
Thank you. So if we don't have another question from the public, I will ask my question for John, because I thought it was very interesting when you got to talk about the dream space. Mm-hmm. That's something I'm really interested into, and I've recently worked on a Chicano comic that has that. So I was doing a bit of research, and in my case, I tied it with because I could. I mean, there was a connection with, for example, the kind of oniric worlds that Fellini produced. But in general, I find it's really interesting that, if I understood right, because I do not know personally this video game, the dream space is somehow sort of utopia for the hunter, where he feels better, where he feels more integrated, and it doesn't feel this like I'm serving this society, but I'm not integrated, and I'm a victim of, I'm a xenophobized subject. So I thought that was really interesting, because quite often the oniric dimension is used in a scary way, in a way more of a nightmare than, despite, we usually say, oh, I dream of beautiful things, but I find that in narrative, quite often it's used, especially when it's horror, as a space where you're scared, where your nightmares come out, where you're sort of in a hallucinatory state or anguish and whatever, a place where that kind of vibe happens. But you say that in this case, it's the opposite almost in this video game. So it's a waking world, that it's the locus of anxiety and the conflict. So I just wanted to understand this a little bit better.
Right. So there's a lot of subversions that occur within that particular title. And one of them, as I mentioned, you touched upon again, is this idea that in dreaming, oftentimes that's the place where people's nightmares come to light. Oftentimes in horror stories, we'll see a vision of the creature, or as you say, anxieties come forth. And also in just the act of sleeping, we're very prone and vulnerable. So oftentimes sleep in these narratives seems as a dangerous place unless we're in a very secure, stable spot. Otherwise, we're in some sort of danger. Whereas in Bloodborne, this idea of reawakening, you go to a place called the Hunter's Dream, but paradoxically, you're more kind of awake there in the sense that you're not facing all these different monsters and all that. That's kind of the dream. It's almost a utopia in that sense. It's one of the very few spots where there's not a direct and immediate danger towards the individual. But when you enter what they call the waking world, that's where you see the werewolves. That's where you see specters. That's where you see these creatures, these things that are impossible, right? And it really follows through with a lot of Lovecraftian ideas that this isn't another world or it's off planet, but it's happening simultaneously. We just don't perceive it because it's we kind of lose that ability of insight. So we don't see these eldritch horrors or these horrific events because it occurs on the other side of the veil, if you will, but they're occurring simultaneously. It's present. And it's interesting to note that it is our conscious world that we have more agency and more control over. That is the one that seems more out of hand, the one that seems everything has gone wild and apocalyptic, and it seems that we can do precious little to prevent these things. But it's in our sleep where we kind of surrender our control, that it's actually much more palliative for ourselves and much more soothing in that sense, even though it's that absence of control. So it almost seems in a strange way that fighting against society or trying to change these normatives, while it's a noble endeavor, it's also it can be a very dangerous one, a very difficult one, and one that we have the illusion of control, but probably not. And we have to face these horrific monsters at all times. But it is really in our individual dreaming that ideas that we can give space to allow ourselves to imagine other possibilities. And while they may not have a direct weight on the waking world, if you will, we can have these moments of reflection. And hopefully from that, we can recoup our strengths to go back into the waking world and face the horrors of it. So it does have metaphorical layers, and of course on a gaming level, so you have these challenges and monsters to overcome, but it does work on that metaphorical layer. I also think it's very interesting, the stratification of dreams and consciousness, of higher orders of consciousness and lower, and what that entails. It also plays with a lot of different constructs of time, and it touches upon a lot of aspects of psychological time, how trauma creates time in a more cyclical fashion. It subverts that era of chronological time. People go back to the event of trauma. There's ideas of arrested development that are also present in the game. And the game, in a lot of ways, touching on what Elizabeth said about knowing history, it is a Japanese game. There's a lot of imagery there that relates very closely to the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, very closely, those images. And you can see the psychological trauma that still occurs to this day just by playing the game, if you know what to look for. Much like, even if you look at pop films like The Avengers, has a lot of 9/11 imagery. So this idea of this trauma that stays almost stagnant in a sense is a very interesting one. And it's one that's worth exploring. And oftentimes we think of time as completely linear, but again, psychological time subverts this.
You know, Jonathan Crary in his book 24/7 argued that there was a sort of an incipient socialist utopia in going to sleep, because there was the idea that we would be looked after when we're vulnerable, and that actually sleep was a kind of communitarian gesture. So I think one of the things we're seeing today is it's not like, you know, it would have been in the 18th century, the sleep of reason creates monsters. It's the reverse. Actually, it's awakened. It's our awakened moment where we see the monsters, and that sleep and the imagination is actually become this, as John was saying, palliative, but actually recuperative, constructive.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating, and it does indeed somehow connect to what I was working on as the dream. The Fellinian dream is a place where you realize things about reality within the dream. And I think it's like a very epiphanic moment when you're in your dream and you realize through the surrealism in the dream, you realize the surrealism that's in reality. So I thought that was very interesting how in this video game, it takes it even further, saying that in the waking world, that's where the monsters are. Well, in the dream world, it's where there's some solace for the character. Well, thank you for your insightful answers. And I think if we don't have any question from the public, you wanted to say something else, Jen?
I was just clicking.
I think we could close.
I wanted to thank you for your moderation.
Yeah, well, that's my job. And I don't know if there's anyone in the public that wants to turn the camera on just to say bye to our speakers. Anyway, I thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. And I think even though they seemed so different at first sight, they actually quite communicated and conversed in a way. So thank you again.